Hello guys, welcome back. My name is Nathan, and today we are going to be discussing the most disappointing player from every single NHL team so far this season. Now, we are more than a quarter of the way through the year, and we've seen a ton of disappointing and surprising teams, but on every single NHL team, there are disappointing players that are refusing to play up to our expectations. But who have been the most disappointing players in the entire NHL this year, and who is the most disappointing player for your favorite NHL team? Watch till the end for all my picks and all the rankings, and make sure to hit that subscribe button if you are new. 55% of the people that are watching are not subscribed. If you like hockey and if you like rankings, this channel is the place to be. Now, usually when we do these one player for every team videos, I like to go through alphabetical order, but today I'm going to go through the NHL standings and go from the highest team in points to the lowest team in points. So that means today we start with the most disappointing player from the Toronto Maple Leafs, and they're a team, although they've had great success recently over the past month especially, there are a couple of players that I think are still a little bit disappointing, and the main one that I go back to is Justin Holl. Now, he wasn't exactly a Nordiques type defenseman last year, but this year he's been borderline horrible, and there was a meme about him being sent down to the ECHL. He honestly might deserve it after his play, especially this past month. He has been dreadful and has been really a bad spot on a Leafs team that has been so much better as of late. But now going on to the second best team in terms of points in the league this season, in the New York Rangers, and their most disappointing player. To me, it's a pretty obvious one, and I hate to say it, but the most disappointing Ranger is easily Alexis Lafreniere. Now, still, the situation, the context does matter. Lafreniere is being played in the bottom six. He's not exactly being given great power play or offensive opportunities, and the players he's with aren't exactly offensive dynamos. Yes, and the position he's in is tough. But at the same time, we really haven't seen Lafreniere be worthy of a top-line spot or anything. In the games he has played, he's shown some flashes of brilliance, but nothing that's been consistent or competent, which is almost the exact same thing that we saw last year, where Lafreniere was probably lacking some confidence, although wasn't in the best position, but wasn't really deserving of that greater spot, and it seems like that scary trend has continued over onto this year. I think he'll still be okay, but it definitely hasn't been a good year from him whatsoever. Now going on to the next team, in the Washington Capitals, their most disappointing player is probably one of their worst players in the team right now, in Carl Hagelin. It's really weird how bad Carl Hagelin has been these past couple of years, but especially this year, he has been downright horrid. In 29 games, he has 1 goal, 4 assists for 5 points, horrible defensive and offensive stats on Washington, and it's crazy that he's still getting played as high as he is right now. He's a guy, though, that honestly, with the way he's playing, should honestly be a healthy scratch. Now we're going to go on to the Florida Panthers, another team that's had some huge success so far this year. I'm not really too surprised, but one guy that I've been really disappointed by has been Spencer Knight, and he was already my most disappointing player as I was going through my picks a couple days ago, but he got shelled in that recent game versus the Ottawa Senators. I think he allowed like 7 goals or something, 8 goals or in that game. So far this year, 13 games played, an .892 save percentage, a minus 7.77 goals above expected, which is 80th among NHL goaltenders. He has been straight horrible and has gone from a Calder candidate to one of the worst goalies in the league. But now going on to one of the most hard teams to actually pick a disappointing player for this year, in the Tampa Bay Lightning, a team that honestly doesn't have many choices whatsoever. All the players that should be playing well are playing fantastically. The one guy that I'm kind of iffy on is Cal Foote, who in 17 games has 1 assist for 1 point. I would have expected maybe the production to be a little bit better, but at the same time, in terms of the eye test, he's actually done really solidly so far this year, so he's not even really that disappointing. It's just he kind of is my default with a Tampa team that's just been solid as ever this season. Now moving on to the next team, in the Carolina Hurricanes. This is a team that has a few options, but the most obvious one is Jesperi Kotkaniemi. Now, Kotkaniemi has been a little bit better over these past couple of weeks, which is great to see. I'm hoping to see some more progress, but at the same time, this was a guy that we all kind of expected to be on a top 6, have great opportunities, and he has, but hasn't really translated that into great play or production. So far this year, in 27 games, has 6 goals, 3 assists for 9 points. Nothing is really happening when he's on the ice, and he's been decent defensively, but that's about the best I can say for him so far this year. Now moving on to the next team, another team that's pretty hard to pick in the Minnesota Wild. I decided to go with their most disappointing player in Jordan Greenway, who so far this year in 29 games has 6 goals, 2 assists for 8 points. He's kind of been on the downtrend though when it comes to Minnesota these past couple of years, and I think he's another guy that Minnesota will likely trade sooner than later. Now going on to the Anaheim Ducks, a team that has been the opposite of disappointing, surprising everybody, including me. They've had a lot of surprises, but the one disappointment to me that I always go back to is Max Comtois, who was their leading goal scorer last year, was such a pivotal part of that offense, and so far this year has 13 games played, 1 assist, 0 points, and is coming off a hand injury. How he was able to just go from a superstar to nothing, and the Ducks have been amazing still, is miraculous, but he has definitely been the most disappointing player on Anaheim. Next up is St. Louis, and they've had a couple interesting options. Nothing that strikes me as an absolute fit, but the guy that I kind of see as the most disappointing is Brayden Schenn. He hasn't been bad per se. He's still been okay, but maybe not to the level that we maybe expected going back to 2020, 2021. So far this year, 19 games, 4 goals, 6 assists, 10 points. Still solid, but definitely, again, not to the level that we might be expecting. Now, the next team we're going to mention here is the Colorado Avalanche, and to me, the most obvious pick, even though he has been much better lately, comes in net and comes with Darcy Kuemper. And so far this year, he's had a really topsy-turvy season. The last few games, he's been fantastic, but season-wide, in 19 games, he has a .907 save percentage, a minus 2.75 goals saved above expected, which is 57th among NHL goaltenders. Although I kind of expect him to have a little bit of a slow start, I didn't really expect him to be this below average. Even though he has been better, he's still been rather disappointing in my opinion. Next up, though, we're going to go on to the Calgary Flames, a team that, just like Anaheim, has been much better than a lot of people expected, even though they've kind of had a slump lately. My most disappointing player throughout the slump and throughout the whole season has been Sean Monahan, and I keep saying it time and time again. Sean Monahan might be one of the most overrated players in the NHL right now, even with guys like Johnny Gaudreau being over a point per game and putting up this great production. Right now, Sean Monahan in 28 games has 4 goals, 9 assists, 13 points. Simply not good enough, and I feel like him being one of their top centers is simply holding them back. Obviously, Lindholm has been much better than Monahan in basically every single way, but I feel like for Monahan, for the amount that they're paying him, for the great play that he had just a few years ago, to be this average is honestly pretty sad. Now, for this next pick, we're going to take a trip on to Nashville and go on to the Preds' most disappointing player, and last year he was a production monster for Nashville, putting in so much work offensively. This year, though, even though he's still been solid in terms of play driving, the production has almost evaporated. Now we're going to go on to the Preds' most disappointing player in Eeli Tolvanen. So far this year, 28 games, 5 goals, 5 assists, 10 points. Now, he does have 4 points in his last 5, which is good momentum, but the production compared to last year is extremely disappointing, even if the momentum is on his side right now. But we're going to move on to the Pittsburgh Penguins next up in the NHL standings, and their most disappointing player, to me, I've kind of gone back on this player time and time again with his Pens tenure, and just had major disappointment. Next up for the Pens' most disappointing player, it has to be Jason Zucker. In 28 games, he has 4 goals, 6 assists for 10 points, and for the Pens paying him more than $5 million for this type of production, that's honestly pitiful. It's horrendous for them, and I feel like even though he has taken a little bit of a step defensively, that production has just been awful and needs to improve, unless Zucker just wants to get traded immediately, which I think the Pens should honestly be looking at. Now we're going to go on to the Vegas Golden Knights here, a team that's been a little bit disappointing so far, but has dealt with some major injuries. They're obviously going to have Jack Eichel pretty soon, but the most disappointing player for me when it comes to Vegas actually is going to be Matthias Janmark. There's not really too much disappointment on Vegas, again, because of the injuries they've had, but Janmark has been a little bit underwhelming this year. 23 games, he's gotten 2 goals, 6 assists for 8 points. He's always a pretty consistent player and was pretty solid production-wise for Vegas last year. This year, though, has definitely been a step down, unfortunately. Now we're going to go on to the Edmonton Oilers, who somehow find themselves 15th in the NHL standings after a fantastic start. They have a few issues right now, obviously, when it comes to consistency and that defense being as bad as it has been. But when it comes to Edmonton, my most disappointing player for them is going to be on the forward, and it's going to be on the forward side with Kailer Yamamoto. He has just been awful this season, and just like last year, hasn't really found his footing, and it feels like it's just an inevitability at this point that he'll be moved. So far this year, when it comes to Kailer Yamamoto, he has 27 games played, 5 goals, only 1 assist, and 6 points. He has been just woefully inconsistent, and again, a guy that I think Edmonton will likely trade sooner than later. Now, we're starting to get into some disappointing teams and some really disappointing players. Next up is the Winnipeg Jets, and their most disappointing player has got to be Blake Wheeler. So far this year, Blake Wheeler's played 22 games, has gotten 1 goal, 16 assists, and 17 points. Obviously the assists are quite well, and he's obviously a playmaker. He's not a goal-scoring machine, but Blake Wheeler only having 1 goal so far is pretty horrendous, and obviously we saw him get this injury these past couple weeks, which is going to have him for even longer, so he's already having a terrible season without that injury, and now you factor that in. So it's not been impressive whatsoever, and I feel like his lack of production and once again horrible defensive play has been a big reason why the Jets have been as lackluster as they've been this year. Next up, we're going to go into the San Jose Sharks, and this player is one of the most frustrating players, I swear, in the entire NHL these past couple of years. If you guys remember back in like 2019, 2020, this was a guy that was simply dominant, but these past couple of years have been awful for him. We're going to go on to Kevin Labanc, the Sharks' easily most disappointing player on the team. So far this year, Labanc has played 21 games, getting 3 goals, 3 assists for 6 points, and just now got a dislocated shoulder, which is going to have surgery on as well. So not only has he always been awful these past couple of years and been disappointing, he's now going to have a dislocated shoulder surgery, which is not going to help things whatsoever. But just remembering how good he was in 2019 2020 makes it even the more disappointing how lackluster he's been. Now going on to the Detroit Red Wings, a team that's in the mix right now for the playoff race and has had some huge stars come up with Maurice Seider and, of course, Lucas Raymond. But in my opinion, the guy that's kind of taken a back seat in all this has been Philipp Zadina. I mean, where is Philipp Zadina right now? It's pretty sad to see how his season has gone. So far this year, in 29 games, he has 4 goals, 6 assists, and 10 points. And he's actually done pretty solidly defensively, I think, this year. And that two-way game has improved. But the production has practically vanished. And I thought with Detroit's potential revival, Zadina would be a huge part of that. And hasn't really been so far this year. Oh, and if we want to talk about disappointing teams, let's just go on to the next team here in the Boston Bruins, a team that has a plethora of choices to make, okay? And disappointing players, they have plates full of them. Anyways, going on to the Bruins' most disappointing player, although it was hard to choose, my most disappointing player has to be Nick Foligno, who so far this year has been absolutely dreadful. In 17 games, has 4 assists, 4 points, 0 goals, and he has just been awful as well in terms of eye test. When we go back to his play in Toronto last year, he was awful there too, but I didn't really expect him to transition that on to Boston. I thought he would have a solid year, especially to start out, and would fill into that system quite well. It's been the opposite so far in Nick Foligno's career, and he makes $3.8 million for the next 2 seasons. Not exactly ideal. Now going on to the LA Kings, a team that has had their disappointing players, gonna be honest, and the most disappointing player for me easily, it was the same way at the start of the season, but still is now, is Calvin Peterson, man. He has just been so sad to watch this year. Compared to last season, Calvin Peterson is a completely different player. Last year, he was pretty dominant, and so far this year, in 11 games, he has an .893 save percentage, a minus 4.09 goals hit above expected, which is 69th in the NHL. It's nice, but it isn't nice for the LA Kings, who have had to deal with his awful play. But now we're going to move on to the Columbus Blue Jackets, a team that's still in the mix and still over 500, even though the past couple weeks have not been as successful for them. But to me, the most disappointing player for them will come on the forward group, and it'll come in the form of Gustav Nyquist, who has been okay this year at best, but definitely not as effective as I thought he would be. Now, to give some context, he did have a torn ligament in his shoulder that kept him out from the entirety of last season, so I was expecting some growing pains, but this year, he's just kind of been there in Columbus, which is sad to see. He's got 4 goals, 6 assists, 10 points in 27 games. He's been just okay, but a lot of other Blue Jackets have been much more effective, much more consistent, and much better for their contracts, let's be honest. Now we're going to move on to my favorite team in the Dallas Stars, and whoo, baby, there is some disappointing players on this team, I tell you. Going on to easily the most, though, the most disappointing. I'm going to be honest, kind of the same situation as Nyquist, where last year he barely played, but I expect him to be much better than he has been this year. for my most disappointing Stars player, it's Tyler Seguin. There's no ifs and buts about it. He has been awful so far this year, especially on 5-on-5. So far this year, for the Stars in 26 games, he has 7 goals, 4 assists for 11 points. I was expecting around maybe a 60-point pace. Obviously, the goal scoring would be pretty solid, but I was expecting to be much more effective on 5-on-5. He has been dreadful, especially defensively. One of the worst players in the entire league on defense so far this year, which he was never a great defensive forward, but that type of impact has definitely made that top 6 for the Dallas Stars struggle a lot more than it should. Now on to the Vancouver Canucks, and there is also some pretty good options here, even though Bruce has definitely improved the team and improved this player in Elias Pettersson. I mean, I feel like I could have gone for Elias Pettersson or someone else. If I went for somebody else, I would have been lying to myself. Elias Pettersson still has been the most disappointing player for the Canucks, but he has 2 points in his last 2, and overall in 30 games, he has 6 goals, 9 assists for 15 points. That will obviously improve with Bruce being there and with Pettersson getting his confidence back. I don't think I'm going to worry too much about him, but again, the start of the season has been pretty dreadful, just like last year, unfortunately. Now going on to the Philadelphia Flyers. Now, I gotta say this right now. A 3-game winning streak for the Flyers, hoping that continues because Flyers fans deserve it, but still season-wide, they've been pretty disappointing, and the one player that I think has been massively disappointing has been James Van Riemsdyk. Not a lot of people realize how amazing, especially on the power play, Van Riemsdyk was last year. This year, though, he has been awful in almost every single way. So far this year in 27 games has 5 goals, 5 assists for 10 points. Now he has been much better, especially over the past 3 games and during this Flyers winning streak, so I'm hoping that continues, but season-wide, he has been a shell of his former self, and his former self was just last year. But now we're going to go on to the New Jersey Devils, and I know there was a lot of people, I put a community post out there saying, who do you guys see as the most disappointing players on your favorite team? A lot of Devils fans said the entire team, which I do get, honestly. But for the Devils, the one guy that really comes to mind for me right now is Ty Smith. I was talking about Ty Smith as one of the most underrated rookies last year, and I still do believe that. I feel like he still has a great future in the NHL, and offensively was great last season for New Jersey. This year, though, all of the good that was there with Ty Smith has been erased, and all the bad has gotten even worse. He has been among the league's worst defensemen in terms of defense, and the offense hasn't even really been that consistent either. Just a mess of a player, and a player that now a lot of people are saying should be sent down the AHL, which is pretty sad considering how effective he was last year. But next up, we're going to move on to the Chicago Blackhawks, and simply put, their most disappointing player has to be Dominik Kubalik, who I'm a big fan of, but this year has kind of been a lot less consistent. So far, 28 games, has 5 goals, 5 assists for 10 points. Usually, you can bet with Kubalik to score a lot of points and to be great on production, but that has unfortunately not been the case so far this year, and hasn't really shown any signs of improvement. Now, moving on to the Seattle Kraken. I was waiting for this moment because it is especially sad for me, because my most disappointing player, we're going to move on to the Seattle Kraken, my most disappointing player for them would be a lot of the team, but specifically the player I bought the jersey for. I don't know why I bought a goalie jersey. I liked Philipp Grubauer, okay? It was a mistake buying a goalie jersey, I know, but now it's even worse with how bad he's been this year. I want to tell you guys how bad Grubauer has been. In 23 games, he has an .882 save percentage. He has a minus 20.16 goals saved above expected. That is horrible. The second last place goalie in goals saved above expected is a minus 10. Grubauer is 2 times worse than the second worst goalie in NHL, which is, by the way, Carter freaking Hutton. Are you kidding me, Grubauer? He has been on a different world of horrible, and it's honestly been pretty unfortunate to see. I bought his fucking jersey! Why do you have to do this to me, Philip? Anyways, I've been crying about it every single night, so I don't want to talk about it anymore. Now we're going to move on to the Buffalo Sabres, and speaking of disappointment, after another great start to the season, they have also fallen off a cliff as expected. But to me, the most disappointing player for the Buffalo Sabres has got to be the player included in the Taylor Hall trade in Anders Bjork. Now, I didn't expect Anders Bjork to become a superstar in Buffalo, but I expect him to get a lot more play time and a lot more opportunity than he has so far. In 26 games, has 4 goals, 1 assist for 5 points, and is only playing about 11 to 12 minutes a night, which is unfortunate, because I do think Anders Bjork does have some potential, but it's obvious that Boston's doing a lot better in that Taylor Hall trade, and again, we better hope that second round pick for Buffalo ends up very, very good. or else it's not looking too great. But now going on to the last 4 teams to mention here, and the bottom 4 teams in the standings, we're going to go next up to the New York Islanders, and just like a lot of teams recently, they have a boatload of choices to talk about. But the main guy that I'm going to go back to as the most disappointing Islanders player is Kyle Palmieri. Kyle Palmieri has been straight horrible, straight just catastrophically awful so far this year. In 24 games, he has 1 goal, 4 assists for 5 points. They're paying him $5 million for the next 4 years. For 5 points. 1 point for every $1 million is what Palmieri is getting right now. That is straight horrible, and the Islanders better hope he's much better next season, because there's nothing that's going on this year. Now we're going to move on to the Ottawa Senators. This is a lot more of a straightforward, disappointing pick, and my pick for the Sens has to be Nick Paul, a guy who I expected a lot more from this year, maybe to potentially break out. 26 games played, 4 goals, 2 assists, 6 points. He was simply electric in the World Championships for Canada this last year, and I thought he'd transition some of that onto Ottawa, but that's just not been the case. Just awfully inconsistent, and a player that has a lot more potential that hasn't really been unlocked. Next up, though, the Montreal Canadiens, and if we're talking about disappointing choices, do I have the whole team to sell you in the Montreal Canadiens. We could go for Jeff Petrie, Ben Sherrod, Dvorak, Sherrod, Caulfield, Savard. All of them counts, but to me, I think the most disappointing will have to be Jeff Petrie. He's a guy that was great for Montreal and has been great for Montreal for years now. This year, though, has been one of the worst defensemen in the entire NHL in almost every single way, and it's pretty sad to see. It's obvious he put his heart out there during that Stanley Cup final run, and this year he's definitely paying the price. Now, the last team we have to mention here is the Arizona Coyotes, and they have been expectedly bad, which means that there's not a ton of disappointing players, but my most disappointing player has got to be the most obvious one in Jakob Chychrun. And although he has been better over the past week, 26 games played, 2 goals, 5 assists, 7 points, he, compared to last year, has been completely different. The confidence, the defensive structure, the overall consistency has been so much more noticeably bad than it was last year. He was great in those areas last season and got a top 10 Norris Trophy voting. That's how good he was, and that's how consistent he was. I'm going crazy because Jakob Chychrun is my boy, and the Coyotes seem to have ruined him somehow. I'm just so sad because he was so good last year and has been so awful so far this year. But that is going to be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy all of these disappointing players, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell for more hockey content just like this. Make sure you comment down below, what are your most disappointing players of the season so far, and who's the most disappointing player on your favorite NHL team? Let me know your thoughts. Make sure you share this video with your friends, get the disappointing players out there, and click on this card right here to watch all of my Hockey Trade Rumor content right in one playlist. My name is Nathan. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.